Hello, everyone. Welcome to One Sustainability. My name is Glenn Turansky. I am an advisory board member at One Business World, our host platform for the One Sustainability conference and series. As part of One Business World, One Sustainability is one of the largest and most comprehensive sustainability platforms and events in the world, and features entrepreneurs, founders, and business leaders who have sustainability as a core component of their overall strategy, presenting on cutting-edge topics and the latest industry innovations. Today, we're very pleased to welcome world-renowned civil engineer and geohydrologist and leading global entrepreneur, Dr. Delton Chen. Delton is the founder of Global Carbon Reward, a system-changing policy for funding climate mitigation, together with healthy ecosystems, vibrant communities, and reliable clean energy. He has accumulated more than 20 years of combined experience in groundwater management, environmental impact assessment, geothermal energy, and climate mitigation. Delton is a thought leader in the development of public policies based on the central bank digital currencies and is a member of the Blockchain Climate Institute. Delton developed the Global Carbon Reward policy to help reduce and remove carbon at the speed and scale that are needed to stabilize the climate and meet the 2015 Paris Agreement. He believes that the Global Carbon Reward can fill the funding gap for climate mitigation and help protect communities and ecosystems from the ravages of climate change and overconsumption. Delton, we're very happy and honored to have you with us here today. You're joining us from Brisbane, Australia, so it's already tomorrow. So thank you for taking some of your Wednesday here with us. And we look forward to hearing more about the global economic solution for real net zero. So welcome to One Sustainability. Let me hand it off over to you, and I'll be back with you afterwards, okay? Welcome.
Glenn, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak here on One Sustainability Conference. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to talk today about the Global Carbon Reward policy. The Global Carbon Reward is a policy, a new policy. I founded this project in 2014. It's a collaborative effort with a nonprofit based in California. And this policy is designed to address the climate crisis. And I'm going to explain how the policy works today in summary. We won't go into too much detail, but I'll cover some of the more interesting features of the policy. So Glenn was so kind to introduce the policy. He's already explained this slide. It is a reward, meaning that it's a positive incentive. It's system changing because it's going to restructure the economy for funding climate mitigation together with healthy ecosystems, vibrant communities, and clean energy. So what that's talking about is two things. One, creating a price signal to fund carbon removal from the atmosphere, to fund cleaner energy, and to fund the clean energy transition for businesses that consume energy and other resources. But the three other items, the healthy ecosystems and vibrant communities and reliable clean energy, that's about co-benefits. So this policy has a primary price signal for mitigation and a secondary price signal for these co-benefits. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Our policy is just launching now for fundraising. So I'm visiting the United States soon in October to talk about the policy and meet people because we're looking for partners and sponsors. For those people who might be interested in our policy project, there are a number of documents that are available to read. We have a summary of the policy, a concept paper, a strategic business plan, and a policy working paper. So please contact us if you would like to see these. By way of background, I think we really need to remind ourselves what the climate crisis is about in terms of global emissions. So cumulative CO2 and other greenhouse gases are really the key driver physically for global warming. And so we need to limit global emissions. And that is quite difficult, obviously, with 195 countries in the world, all operating on their own political agendas. So today we know that we would need to achieve net zero emissions by roughly mid-century to remain under 1.5 degrees. By the year 2030, that would imply that we would almost not quite halve, but nearly halve our global emissions, which is a tremendously ambitious, if not impossible, objective. So probabilistically speaking, it would appear that the world will not be able to stay under 1.5 degrees in terms of absolute emissions. Therefore, there would be a requirement to take carbon out of the atmosphere with carbon dioxide removal technologies if we were to stay under 1.5 degrees. And I'll talk more about that. But this chart, which comes from Climate Action Tracker, it reveals the different levels of ambition from policies that are currently operating, taking us to over 2 degrees. And then there are more stringent targets provided by governments as pledges and nationally determined contributions. So we're currently heading probably to about at least 2 degrees of global warming if governments were to implement all of their pledges and promises. Now, we can't say for sure if that will happen, but moreover, 2 degrees would be quite dangerous. We already see quite severe droughts and floods already. Just recently, worst droughts on record in China this year, terrible droughts in Europe, and of course for Americans, you would notice the record-breaking droughts on the West Coast and around California. So we're familiar with these extremes now, but they're only going to get much worse. The International Energy Agency has some great reports on what we would have to do to remain under 1.5 degrees, if that is indeed our objective. This graph here is quite interesting because it's from a simulation they did to illustrate the energy transition for 1.5 degrees. And I think what's important about this simulation is how fast we would have to transition out of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, into other forms of energy, in particular more renewables, bioenergy, and so on. Now, what's interesting I find about these simulations is that they project an actual peaking of total energy about now, and then it plateauing off till past mid-century. And this would happen possibly because of major increases in energy efficiency and electrification. Also interesting, but not shown in this graph, excuse me, is the idea that the economy will still be growing and potentially reaching 300 trillion per year of GDP by mid-century. Also, along with major increases in global population, upwards of 10 billion people this century, with many of those new people being born in Africa and other parts of the world, of course. So this is the backdrop, the backstory to a potential future. And given that it's such a rapid transition, we have some real problems. One problem would be how to fund such a transition and how to actually manage so much change so quickly. Various institutions have estimated the funding gap, sometimes called the climate finance gap, for such an energy transition. And the numbers vary, but the missing finance is roughly 3 to 6 trillion per year for a few decades. These numbers come from various organizations. Also, the numbers change depending on whether we want more money for the Sustainable Development Goals. Nonetheless, there is a major finance gap. And on top of that finance gap, there's more money that would be needed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that bill could be very, very large indeed, depending on how far we overshoot the carbon balance. So the more we overshoot, we have multiple problems. It becomes more expensive to pull carbon out. It becomes more expensive to do a late transition. And we have more climate damages to deal with. And that would also precipitate nonlinear changes in ecosystems and the climate system itself, with positive feedback effects, for which we don't really understand the dynamics yet and what the full impacts could be of these positive tipping elements in the climate system, such as thawing permafrost, warming of the Arctic oceans, melting of sea ice, and so on and so forth. So we are actually having a major risk management problem throughout this century, for which we don't really have a cogent and well-coordinated international response. So what do we do about this wicked problem? I put forward the idea that we need actually a new theory on carbon pricing to resolve this climate crisis. In fact, I wouldn't say it's really a new theory, but an expanded theory, taking standard economic theory and asking the question, is there something missing? Why aren't we able to cooperate? Why don't we have the scalable finance we need? There are also some theoretical conundrums and paradoxes actually within the economic theory itself, and leading economists don't actually agree on what the ideal carbon tax should be. Also, carbon taxes tend to be politically unpopular, and when they have to rise very high, they become politically and socially impractical. So let's have a look at an alternative. So the global carbon reward is probably most popularly discussed in terms of the instrument, which is called a carbon currency. And we give it the ticker name XCC. That's X is a type of currency that is supranational and is somewhat experimental, or it could be representing a commodity like gold or silver. In this case, it's representing carbon. The unit of account is 1 ton of mitigated carbon dioxide for a 100-year duration. So it's really important to have a well-defined unit of account, and noting that we're not actually talking about a commodity here. It's the service of mitigating greenhouse gases. Another interesting point about a carbon currency as an instrument is that the reward, the financial reward, is not the currency itself. That the reward is actually the exchange rate, because when you express the currency value as an exchange rate, you have the units that you need to define a reward. In this case, in this example, the quote currency is US dollar. Therefore, the reward is US dollars per ton of CO2 mitigated for 100-year duration. And the base currency could be any currency. Therefore, it's really quite convenient to have a currency as a reward, because you can express it in any currency just by looking up graphs in the foreign exchange market. Having said that, I'd like to start again by talking about a novel that was published around 2020-21 by Kim Stanley Robinson. Many people in the audience may have heard of this book or have even read the book, because it has been discussed quite widely by environmentalists and thought leaders in economics. It caught people's attention because Kim Stanley Robinson wrote like a cli-fi or sci-fi story about the near-term future, I think running through 2030 to 2040 approximately. And in this story, a series of events unfold as the world's struggling to come to terms with global warming, until there's a breakthrough with the advent of a carbon coin that's backed by central banks. So Mr. Robinson based this story on a paper I wrote with my colleagues in 2019. And so our policy actually features in the book. However, there's some differences between the actual policy and the book. We'll talk about that in a moment. I think what's interesting about the novel and our real world situation is that we are struggling to deal with our lack of control over our carbon balance and the economy. So really, climate change is a problem of control. And when you have a control problem, the situation is classically like this shown. You have a system, which is the economy and the climate. You have feedback of information, which is our understanding of global warming and our carbon budget. And we feed that back into controllers, which are policies. So we might have market policies or regulatory, and we have lots of conferences and discussions to try and feed back to change the system. And in fact, that's what the global carbon reward is doing, and that's what all policies are trying to do. So climate change is a crisis of control. The policy, the way it works in the real world, the way we hope it would work, is with a carbon currency, as I said, not a carbon coin. The carbon currency is unique because it would be a performance-based grant, and it's not a subsidy. Key point, it's not subsidizing technologies to help them along, it's actually rewarding them for an outcome. A bit like being paid to do any job, you're being paid to do a service. So it comes with service level agreements, which are contracts that are long-term, and these will stipulate all the fine details and obligations, the measurement, reporting, verification, and so on. The reward through time will have a predictable price, a floor, and this is very important because with predictable prices, we can then plan ahead, markets can plan with their investing, and they're not troubled by uncertainty in carbon prices. And this is especially important when you have high capex, high opex projects such as in energy infrastructure. It's not a carbon credit. This is important because a carbon credit today means that if you mitigate emissions somewhere, you can sell that credit to offset someone's pollution elsewhere. The carbon currency is not designed for that. It will not offset any emissions, and all the carbon is retired immediately. And this will help to de-risk the entire problem of mitigation. The carbon currency will be issued debt-free, and there are no direct costs to any stakeholders, that's citizens, businesses, or governments. And the reason that is possible is that we're funding this policy through monetary policy. So we're funding the currency through monetary policy. And with this predictable price and the fact it's a tradable asset, having a predictable floor price means it's a limited risk asset that can be traded. There's a lot of theory behind this, so we might have to leave that to another time, but the expanded theory is really what's not in the novel. So the novel doesn't go into these details. And some people misunderstand the carbon currency. They think it's a cryptocurrency, or they think it's an ad hoc, I don't know, market price. It doesn't fit in with normal economic theory. But here there's a new theory that's been put forward that we need carrot and stick carbon pricing. And the theory says that, or proposes that, carrots and sticks will maximize cooperation. We really need that cooperation. This is key. So in my opinion, there are two really important benefits or outcomes from a global carbon reward. One is the ability to get people to cooperate, and the other is to provide scalable finance. So this is why I think carrot and stick carbon pricing is so important, and we're providing the global carrot. The scalable finance, that's provided through a new role for central banks. And this is also quite, perhaps you might say, revolutionary and a bit controversial, but this approach and the theory gives central banks a specific responsibility, and we can talk about that later as well. Another feature I mentioned at the beginning is that the policy provides social co-benefits. So that's very important, because if we have an energy transition and a major industrial transition, that can cause impacts to people locally, and it can have negative impacts. Windmills and solar panels do take up space and they interfere with the environment. So we have to look carefully both social and ecological co-benefits and try to reduce the harms as much as possible. And the policy has a mechanism to attempt that. Just coming back to the theory, carrots and sticks. What do I mean by carrots and sticks? Well, what's interesting in in economics today, standard theory, is that there are a number of major policies which are well known. One is the carbon tax, the other is a carbon subsidy, and then we have cap and trade. And there are others as well. However, the carbon tax and carbon subsidy, they're really linked together. And they're like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The reason they're linked is because they're both from Arthur Pigou and the theory of Pigou about negative and positive externalities. So there's a formalization there around those two policies. What I've done is taken them and put them together in a relational diagram, and I call it the carbon pricing matrix, or you could call it carrot stick carbon pricing. By joining them together into a larger jigsaw puzzle, what I claim is that it reveals we're missing another policy which completes the little jigsaw puzzle, and it's called the carbon rule. So the two policies on the left, they are explained by Arthur Pigou, who is famous in economics. He wrote a treatise on market failures about 100 years ago. When people talk about taxes, they call it the Pigouvian tax, the Pigouvian subsidy for the negative or positive externalities. And on the right, we have Ronald Coase, who's famous for the Coase theorem, which helps to understand why cap and trade works, how the trading of the emissions permit allows private actors, when transaction costs are low, they can realize an optimum when they internalize the externality. A lot of technical language there, sorry about that. But the columns of this little matrix show that on the left, we're dealing with fiat units as the main store of value in the policy. And on the right, we create new carbon units. I mentioned the tradable permit and cap and trade. And hence, it points to the idea of a carbon currency in our new policy called carbon reward. So the carbon reward, by comparison, we could also have called it mitigate and trade to be similar in name to cap and trade, but carbon reward sounds a bit better. So that's the carbon pricing matrix. For those people who are interested in this, there's more about the matrix that explains other types of carbon pricing. And if people are interested, please reach out to me. We need to come back and away from the theory for a moment and look at the actual problem of the greenhouse gas emissions that the world is producing and what to do about it. So this is a graph which reveals a trajectory for 2 degrees. And you'll notice that we need to avoid the emissions shown as dark green. And we also need to remove carbon from the atmosphere, shown as the teal color on the bottom of the graph. And the reason is when you add those two together, they will go to net zero sometime this century. In this example, it's quite late in the century, around 2090. But that's just a scenario. We shouldn't pay too much attention to the magnitude of this graph, but just the concept. So the concept is that we have conventional mitigation for the dark green, and then we have actual residual carbon emissions shown as the brownish colors, and then below the removal. And what this policy does is that it offers the reward for carbon removal an explicit price. And this is the long-term price, which I'll show you in a moment. The amount of removal is very large that we'll need. We're talking 1 to 10 gigatons of CO2 per annum, which is a huge amount. The conventional mitigation is supported with 2 policy rules. 1, a reward for cleaner energy, and then 2, a reward for cleaner business. The reason this makes sense is because the first rule is on the supply side of energy, and then the second rule is on the demand side of energy. And then, of course, the third rule is for carbon removal. So we're really covering the whole problem. So this is how the policy is structured, the 3 rules: cleaner energy, cleaner business, and carbon removal. And as I said before, there's no carbon offsetting in this policy. So now I'm just going to talk about the price signal. I mentioned that we need to fund carbon removal. And the way this policy is currently structured is that we would calibrate our reward price for that purpose of funding carbon removal. And I think this is a good idea because it would be difficult, I imagine, for countries to cooperate properly on how to fund this 1 to 10 gigatons per annum. For example, the Green Climate Fund has had trouble raising $100 billion per year. And a lot of that money that they have raised is actually loans and not grants. Now, here we have another problem. We have a problem that's going to cost upwards of $1 trillion a year. That's 10 times more. And it cannot be funded with loans, probably. And the reason is carbon removal is going to be a cost because it requires energy as an input. And there's no guarantee you can sell anything on the open market that people really want to buy. So it becomes an essential public service and a real cost. Therefore, we need grants, and that's why the policy is structured the way it is. So what you're looking at here is a hypothetical price signal for around 100 years, and it's determined on the amount of removal we would need at the minimum. That way, we're not over-promising and we're not encouraging more emissions. We're just being very conservative about the price signal. And it has two phases. The first phase is rising and then second phase falling. And this has implications for markets because in the rising phase, our carbon currency becomes an investment vehicle at the same time, and that will attract the private sector to buy the currency. Over time, you'll see what happens, that the actual spot price of the carbon currency can rise above the floor price. The floor price is guaranteed by central banks. And we have this green period, which is our guarantee period. It could be maybe 10 years long, approximately. And beyond that, we have forward guidance to the future value of the currency. And that forward guidance is long-term, and it can be modified periodically in response to changes in the climate and our economic situation and so on. So this is really how the price signal works. It's highly predictable. It gives the market a bankable price that they can borrow against in debt markets with commercial banks and so on, development banks, and it allows them to do long-term planning, which I think is vitally important for the carbon removal market. We could talk more about this, but I'll just move on for the sake of time. How is the reward issued? Well, it's not that complicated, but there are a lot of details. So we begin with an authority for the policy. We might call it the Carbon Exchange Authority. In the novel by Kim Stanley Robinson, it's called the Ministry for the Future, but that's just another name. So this authority issues service level agreements. So companies that want to mitigate have to agree to an agreement and sign on. They have to abide by the rules. It's a voluntary process, and they volunteer their data. There are periodic assessments by third-party certified qualified assessors, which could be consultancies all around the world will be doing this in this new market. And the rules will determine how much carbon currency to issue periodically. And we need to be aware that the carbon currency, if you're leaking carbon, that can be called back in a kind of a chargeback if necessary. So there are lots of details that we don't have time to go through, but this service level agreement approach is long-term, and it will cover all the scenarios that would be involved in a reward market. I'd like to talk a bit about energy now. The reward can be used to fund cleaner energy projects. I pointed that out with Rule 1 for cleaner energy. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about why this could be very helpful. The earlier graphs I showed from the IEA, they're very dramatic in the way that they reveal we would need to transition quickly out of fossil fuels. And the IEA has said that we can't really extract from new fields, we can't extract from new oil or gas fields, and we can't be extracting coal anymore. If we're to stay under 1.5, that has to stop. But how do you stop this development when you have developing countries in particular that are looking for revenue and they have fossil fuel assets. There's two good examples at the moment. One is in the Republic of Congo, there's the peatland forests, and in Ecuador, there's the Usuni National Park. Both these sites have abundant oil and gas and mineral deposits, and these nation states want to develop them for the revenue because they need economic development. So what we can do in our policy is that we can offer these countries or offer these license holders the carbon currency reward with performance obligations, whereby we offer them enough reward to cover the profit opportunity of those licenses, but with conditions that they have to reinvest this profit that they've suddenly realized, reinvest it into strategic renewable energy infrastructure, which they will own and operate. So they can immediately retire the sites, they can take the carbon currency and then build out the renewable infrastructure in their country or in other countries. And this will provide them with revenue and development finance debt-free. This is one way that we could protect these sites which are ecologically valuable and also a home to Indigenous societies. So I thought I would mention that because it's quite an interesting concept. It's also mentioned in the novel about paying to keep fossil fuels in the ground. I'm coming a bit closer to the end of this presentation. I've left out a lot of details, but you know, we don't want to go too far in the details at this point. Here, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the policy could be used to incentivize co-benefits for sustainability and fairness. So there is a genuine concern that a transition would potentially harm ecosystems and societies. So the idea here is that we open up the policy with a platform for stakeholders to be able to tell the policymaker what their priorities are for their own well-being. So that's communities, residents, people who work in industries that support the renewable energy sector. What do they want for their own well-being? The policy platform can also accept information from scientists and land carers about ecosystem health, and then we can accept advice from energy experts. So we rank these issues and we develop a scoring mechanism for projects and score them all. If we have enough data, we can score them and rank the projects and then adjust their rewards. So we create a secondary price signal that gives the project owners and the investors enough incentive to really start thinking about how they can improve their projects to help community well-being, to protect ecosystems, and to make energy supplies more reliable. This policy also will charge fees in carbon currency, and these fees will fund the whole policy administrative system. Now, earlier I mentioned that this is a policy to be supported with monetary policy. And so the fact that it's funded through monetary policy and we have our own fees charged in the carbon currency, what's interesting is the whole policy can be self-funded through the carbon currency approach, which we could discuss another time as well. Coming back to central banks, I think there are two major questions about this policy that people should ask and should be of some concern, but I think we have good answers. One issue is mandates for central banks. The other issue is how the monetary policy actually works, how does it expand the money supply, and does that lead to monetary inflation, and could it lead to other economic problems? We don't have time to go through that complex topic here today, but I'll just focus on mandates. So here's a statement from Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank. And she noted recently that central banks are not responsible for climate policy, and the most important tools that are needed lie outside of our mandate. Now, I just want to respond to this statement that people in the central bank community have said repeatedly that the central banks should be looking carefully at their role in this climate crisis, and they are making confident strides forward, and they are working very hard on this, I assume. However, I don't agree with Christine Lagarde. I think there's theory missing and a missing understanding that the monetary system we're using, fiat money, is actually a contributing factor to both economic growth, energy consumption, and global warming. And I argue that central banks' mandate should be expanded from their financial stability responsibility to also include global warming, which logically would lead to major financial instability. If global warming and environmental impacts are allowed to run away from us, it will be enormously destabilizing. I think that's only logical. However, maybe Christine Lagarde, I think her concern there is that governments won't do their part, and they're going to try and lump the problem onto the central banks in a disorderly way. But that's not what we are proposing with this policy. The policy has a clear role for central banks, and it's not an onerous role, it's a currency trading role. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, she spoke at COP26 and at one of the earlier sessions. I wasn't there myself, but I watched some of it on the internet. And she said, the central banks of the wealthiest countries engaged in 25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years. And the point I want to make here is that the level of finance that we need to fill the climate finance gap is of the order of 3 to 6 trillion per year. And it's quantitative easing really that goes to scale that can provide that level of finance. And we can see it in the response to COVID-19 and global financial crisis. In this policy, we're not actually proposing that kind of quantitative easing, though. This is going to be orderly, long-term, and calibrated, and it's going to provide purchasing power for market actors in the real productive economy. So the way we would manage what's called carbon quantitative easing is to support the energy transition and real productivity, and not to simply inflate the value of financial assets in the finance, insurance, and real estate sectors of the economy. So I thought I'd just make that point. It is a complex topic, but that's just the general view I have at the moment. If people watching this presentation would like to contact us or potentially even partner and support our project, we are currently looking for foundation grants and sponsorship from corporates and philanthropists. So please reach out, and we'd love to hear from you. Glenn, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Delton, thank you. Very, very informative. Complex topic, huh? Complex topic for sure. It's interesting on some of your charts and graphs. It's really a history lesson when you think about it. It was like, I mean, you go back to Arthur Peugeot in 1920 and 1960 for Mr. Kaus there. I mean, it's a long run up to the issue, and it's a long kind of fix in a way, right? You've got 100 years of history there, going back to 1920, and what you're proposing, I think, from a climbing out standpoint, is realistic. You know, you're recognizing that it's going to take time, things have to be built, but you're building on what is otherwise a standard theory, and then taking it forward, which I find really interesting, especially from a history standpoint. Interesting. You mentioned Christine Lagarde and her points. David Malpass here from the World Bank, I think this week took a lot of heat for expressing a similar view about climate and what is the real mission of the bank. And it would seem, I'm curious your take on this. Doesn't sound like it's that fine of a line, that there's a lot of overlap between mission and carbon, and when you look at the types of tools that the world bankers have, perhaps it can't just be compartmentalized like that, and you have to kind of keep a larger view. I was curious what you thought about that.
It's a very interesting topic, the history of money and how civilization came to be in this situation. My view is that the root problem at the moment is a philosophical problem, and it causally stems back to Pugu's theory on externalities. So I'll just explain quickly. In my opinion, Arthur Pugu, he got it right. He's a very clever model for changing the prices of goods and services so that there's a new equilibrium, call it equilibrium, when you take into account the costs of impacts on society, the externality, the negative externality. That's fine. He also has these positive externalities, which we don't really talk about very much. But my point is that that theory, it doesn't consider the whole economy as a system as being structurally causal to a market failure. So my opinion is that the market failure in carbon is different because it's the very economy itself and its core structures that are locking us into a kind of behavior where we have to keep growing, we have to keep consuming fossil fuels, because if we don't, we harm ourselves in the existing economy. So it's called carbon lock-in, or the carbon lock-in effect. In game theory, it's called a Nash equilibrium. So we're locked in, and my thinking is that the monetary system itself is part of that lock-in, and then the financial system, the legal system supports that, and then the political system as well, education, media. So all of our societal systems are locking us in. Now, if we take on this model, conceptual model, the question is, how do you unlock? And the proposal here is with parallel currency. So if we introduce the carbon currency approach, like we've described, the idea is we can circumvent this lock-in effect. And this would then require the central banks to understand this concept that we're trying to patch up the economy, adding things to it, fixing it with ad hoc approaches. And I think we need a structural change now. And many people have said in the past, oh, we need a systemic change, but what does that mean? And if we can give it meaning philosophically, then we have another roadmap where we could potentially create exponential change. Otherwise, we're only entertaining incremental changes, which won't get us to our objectives.
I think the history lesson behind it, I think, is an important one, because I'm a big believer in you have to know where you come from to know where you're going. And by basing it on that kind of foundation, it gives you the opportunity to kind of look ahead. Have you done much work with the United Nations? You think about their sustainable development goals, and your carbon rewards and currency here would seem to kind of hit one of their 17 tiles as you look at the goals in there. I'm just curious if you've had kind of conversations with them, or is this something that they would be following as part of their work?
I haven't yet engaged with the UN. I'm looking to have a meeting with somebody in the UN soon, but it relates very strongly to the Sustainable Development Goals, because SDG 13, which is climate, if we don't address SDG 13, the other goals will fall away, because everything's really tied to the climate. The policy also, as I explained in the presentation, it does also provide that secondary price signal where we adjust the rewards. And it has a lot of flexibility, because what we want to do is invite the stakeholders to define what they want. That way we bring in stakeholder representation and allow people to express their own sustainable development objectives. So I would hope that the UN would find this interesting. Our logo, by the way, has 17 leaves. I don't know if you noticed, 17 colored leaves to correspond to the 17 SDGs.
Very good, very good. You had the healthy ecosystem, vibrant communities, and reliable clean energy. I mean, even stripping away all the complexities and the equations and the like, those are clearly three sets of goals that anybody could sign on for. When you think about moving forward. And I wonder, when you think about the technicalities around it, I think always re-emphasizing the qualitative nature of what you're doing. Again, I think that becomes very, very important for people as they look at it.
Yes, I think that we have to be a bit realistic about this climate and energy transition, in that it's not going to be a utopia. I'm not a utopianist. I'm not a techno-optimist. I like to think I'm a bit objective and realistic in that when we build out new infrastructure, there are inputs. There's metals, there's plastics, there's fossil fuels, water, and resources. And that's going to have an impact of its own. If you look at solar panels, they can impact on land, take up agricultural land, windmills, so on. And we've got to be realistic that there's always a trade-off. Indeed, the theoretical aspect of the policy, why it's so unique, is that at the macro, it's proposing a macroeconomic trade-off. So the theory of Pigou, which we have from the past, the history lesson, is that Pigou's theory was actually designed around the notion of improving efficiency. Improve the efficiency of the market by internalizing the externalized costs, social cost to carbon, with a carbon tax or something like that. And what I'm saying is that that theory is robust, it's sensible, but we need to bring in a second objective where they're complementary to each other in what's called a two-objective optimization. So just very quickly, I'll give an example to make this more clear. The new theory that I'm putting forward, it's a hypothesis, is that we need a second objective, which is to be effective in managing the carbon balance for safety. And this objective is to be physically effective. And the safety aspect is it's a role of physical insurance. So an example would be when you go shopping and you're buying something at the supermarket, let's say you're buying some fruit, apples, you love apples. So you want the best quality apples and you want the maximum number of apples. The problem is there's a trade-off because better quality are more expensive and then you don't have as much quantity. So if you can imagine the trade-off between quality and quantity for buying apples, as a simple example, what I'm proposing is we need the trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness in dealing with climate change. So when you get the right balance between being effective and efficient, you have the benefits of both, but there is a trade-off here. And this is where economists, I think, have a philosophical hole in standard theory, that they don't really know how to manage both. They're trying to resolve them both with the carbon tax, but I argue the tax is not the appropriate tool for cooperation. So the key things of this policy, it provides cooperation with carrots and sticks and scalable finance. So if you can get the cooperation and the finance together, then you could have exponential change. And of course, you need information. So the policy will pull in information and share it instantaneously through the internet. And that's the way I think the global carbon reward could work.
Well, as you said on one of your diagrams, you're becoming kind of the final piece of the puzzle as it plays out. And I think focusing on it, as you said, as a reward or an incentive, as opposed to a tax, or even, sometimes governments love to hand out subsidies, right? And every government's got a history with, well, have they been successful or not? Focusing more on the reward and the incentive side, I think, from trying to change minds and hearts, I think would certainly be helpful on that front. How about nuclear? How does that play in? You had that on the chart, and I think it was yellow on one of them. Curious how you view that as part of the puzzle here.
Sure, that graph was from the IEA, not my graph, of course.
Okay.
The policy, technically speaking, it doesn't have a view on nuclear or any other energy source, because it will look at new technologies in terms of their mitigation benefit. And I do believe nuclear would mitigate a lot of emissions because it's relatively low carbon. However, the decision about whether nuclear would be used or not really falls back on local laws and regulations. So we wouldn't be rewarding any projects that are somehow not allowed, that they're not legal under their own jurisdiction. So I'm not too concerned about that because nuclear is controversial. I think we also have to be open-minded that there are new technologies being developed around the world to try and break through some of the past problems with nuclear technology. I'm not an expert in nuclear, so I rather leave that to other people to look at the details.
Okay, but could depending on the government and the like, could be part of the accumulation of an incentive or a credit at that point as well down the line.
Yes, I don't see why not. Technically, yes, it would make sense if it's effective, and maybe our future is a mix of nuclear and renewables. Once again, I'm not the expert. I know it's an emotive topic too, so I'm not taking a strong position. I'm just saying yes. I think it's in the mix. It is in the mix.
Here in the United States, when you look at the Securities and Exchange Commission, they're doing a lot of rulemaking at the moment on climate disclosures and emission disclosures. And I wonder, just thinking out loud, anytime you hear the word currency, right, in anybody's title, you wonder if financial regulators would come back, banking or otherwise, and say, well, this is a new asset class potentially. It could even be considered a security. Maybe we should have some sort of rulemaking surrounding that as well. I don't know if you've ever thought about that as a potential complement to trying what you're doing, or perhaps even maybe something that might slow it down, because then you're getting kind of more cooks in the kitchen there as you're thinking about it going forward.
Moving forward, I think you have a good point. We would need to have financial lawyers or experts to tell us if a carbon currency needs to be regulated by the SEC or whomever. And we're just not quite at that point yet, because we need funding to document the policy. And what we're looking for, the reason we're looking for funding, we're seeking money to demonstrate the policy. And this will be a role-playing demonstration. And then we'll also do surveys with experts. So we would actually probably find somebody in the Securities Exchange Commission, possible, interview them and ask them what they think. And that's how we would address those types of questions. We'd interview central bankers and economists and policymakers. And that's part of our proposed demonstration and our strategic plan. We'd also add to that quantitative assessments, with integrated assessment models and that type of thing, if possible, because we need a balance of quantitative assessment, seeking expert advice, and doing a role play to explore really carefully how this policy would influence decision makers. So I think the key here is, can we influence decision makers, the investors in projects who are really making those decisions about the go, no go for any kind of mitigation project?
Again, and you use one of the key words we hear today throughout financial markets or policy. That's the word stakeholder. It's this ripple effect, and it's all of the people that not only can you name off the top of your head, but maybe some of them that you can't even come up with yet, that are going to have kind of a vested interest in your work and looking kind of forward to continuing to get that funding, to kind of working through the project and then moving it ahead. So it's fascinating. It's just fascinating work for sure. Well, listen, Dr. Delton Chen, thank you for joining us today on One Sustainability. We really appreciate your presentation. It's very, very artful, very, very right here in the moment. We're at that kind of point here in our society that this type of work is so important. So we really appreciate you joining us today. We wish you the best of luck going forward. We look forward to hopefully seeing you again in the future, and continued success in all your great work.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It's been an absolute pleasure and anytime.
Thank you for joining us today. Take good care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.